I've got a legitimate question that Georgia fans probably don't want to hear or don't want to know if the answer is a certain way. Has Georgia football reached its peak? Have we already seen Georgia on the top of the mountain? Will it get better than it has been the last few years? That is my question. And look, I'm not saying that Georgia football, and also I'm not necessarily arguing that Georgia football has reached its peak. I think it might be in the middle of a peak, if that makes more sense. But will it get better than it has been the last few years? Because even as Nick Saban admitted to Kirby Smart, no one has done what you just did over the last couple of years. That's essentially what Saban said to Smart, around the SEC championship game. I believe right before the SEC championship game, he told him, Kirby, in these last 3 years, man, no one has done what you've done. 29 wins in a row. 29 wins in a row. And two of those wins being national championship games. Two of those wins being semifinals games. One of those wins being an SEC championship game, right? There were some huge wins roped into that 29-game win streak. And, Georgia lost to Alabama the game before that 29-game win streak started. And there were 12 more straight wins right before that. So it's been quite the incredible run for the Dogs over the last few years, especially when you just look at it starting in 2020, starting at this decade, and now there has been 4 seasons out of like a 10-year decade, right? I mean, there's been 4 seasons out of it that are done. 20, 21, 22, and 23. That's a pretty good sample size for this decade so far. And in that stretch, Georgia's lost to 2 programs. Georgia's lost 4 games, and they've lost to 2 football programs since 2020. They've lost to Alabama 3 times, twice in the SEC championship and once at Tuscaloosa, and they lost to Florida and Jacksonville in 2020. So Georgia lost 2 games in 2020 in Jacksonville against Florida, and then at Alabama in Tuscaloosa, and they lost the 21 SEC championship and the 23 SEC championship. Other than that, since 2020, Georgia hasn't lost. That's it. Just the Gators and the Alabama Crimson Tide have beaten the Dogs. And that's kind of my point. I don't know that we'll ever see a stretch like that again. And I think it's going to be... Look, is it impossible for any program to have a stretch like that? No, but as I've hammered the nail in over and over again on, is that college football, I think, is about to get a lot harder. And I think we have to consider if Georgia has already seen its best days. Ryan Kelly from Dawg Post posing a question that I'm a little bit serious about and not quite sure about. How will Kirby Smart and company handle moving forward? Because I think a few of the reasons, or at least one of the reasons why Georgia was able to sustain the level of success the last couple of years might change a little bit. And you're seeing it with the transfer portal over the last week or so, right? A bunch of players are leaving. You're seeing starters go, right? You're seeing guys that they consider starters or are straight up starters enter the transfer portal and leave. Jamon Jimis Johnson, the biggest name so far for Georgia to leave the transfer portal. Now, I'm going to give a quick opinion on that. I think Jamon Jimis Johnson, whatever you call him, is a fantastic football player. But those young linebackers are legit. And who knows what the conversation was behind the scenes. And I think everyone kind of expected Pop to not be around in 2024 regardless, right? Just thought he'd be in the league instead of, looking at his options elsewhere in college football. But C.J. Allen, Raylan Wilson, those freshman linebackers they have coming in, and Smile Munden will also be returning, even though Xavier Story isn't. The linebacker room will probably be just fine, and it'll probably be good, actually. But then you look at an outside linebacker like Marvin Jones Jr., who also decides, hey, you know what, I'm going to look elsewhere. I don't think I'm going to stick around in Athens anymore. It's been 2 years. I played a little bit. I didn't play a ton that first year. I played more that second year. So then Marvin Jones Jr. looks around and says, yeah, I'm probably going to head out as well. Right? Those were contributors. Those were starters for this Georgia football team. And that wasn't something that happened that much beforehand. And with the changes in college football and the transfer portal, we saw a couple of main pieces leave Georgia over the last few years. Jermaine Burton being one of them. A very good wide receiver, obviously, that went to Alabama. A.D. Mitchell, same thing. These are guys that can make the NFL. Last year, we saw the immediate effect with a couple guys, with A.D. Mitchell. Don't sit here and tell me that losing A.D. Mitchell and Bear Alexander weren't huge losses for Georgia. All right? If those two guys are on the roster, things are a little different. Because what did Georgia deal with all year long on offense? Injuries, injuries, injuries galore. Injuries to your weapons. Brock Bowers, Ladd McConkey, Ra Thomas, all the running backs, right? You don't think having an NFL receiver out there would have changed things for the Georgia offense? And then flip it around. Bear Alexander, whatever opinion you have of him, talented football player. And probably would have been the most talented player on the interior defensive line for Georgia in 2023. So, excuse me. Don't sit here and tell me that that wasn't a huge loss for the Dogs. So we're already seeing the effects of the transfer portal hit. Depth. That's what it's going to hurt. And that's my roundabout point for this. Let's go back to 21 and 22 when Georgia was at its, let's call it its hypothetical peak for this argument. Georgia was at its hypothetical peak during the back-to-back run, 21 and 22. What did it have? A ton of depth. I mean, oh my, a ton of talent across the board. You look at that defense, you see a lot of guys that didn't leave. They waited their turn, or and then you saw one of them be a transfer guy in Darian Kendrick. That was an obviously great. He was the number one corner for Georgia in 21, right? So you saw a mixture of both. But what you see? You saw guys like Jordan Davis, Devontae Wyatt be around for 4 years. You saw depth across classes, right? 2018, Jordan Davis. 2019, Trayvon Walker. 2020, Jalen Carter, all on that defensive line. You saw depth, right? Those guys all, whether their turn came immediately or it came a year or 2 or 3 later, all of those guys were contributors. Quay Walker, Nakobe Dean, Channing Tindall, right? The depth was insane, and I think it's a legitimate concern to look around and say, will the depth ever be like that again? Because you've got corners like A.J. Harris, a 5-star corner, who, isn't going to stick around and see it through with the Dogs, right? What would he have become in the future for Georgia? Would he have been a contributor? You know what I mean? And these are some of this is slightly hypothetical, but yes. Now, here's the other reason why Georgia might have possibly seen its best days. Is Georgia going to go, are they're going to lose more games maybe? It's going to be tougher to win. I'm not saying it's definitely not impossible to have an undefeated regular season. It's just going to be more impressive if it does happen, no matter, and it will depend on the conference. Will an undefeated season in the Big 12 be impressive, comparatively speaking? Will it be or will it be as impressive as going undefeated in the SEC? I would venture to say no, unless you look at the situation with a microscope and you just say this Big 12 situation was much more impressive. But no, I wouldn't say that all the conferences are created equal. I don't think that's going to change. With Kirby, I think we knew pretty immediately. First years are first years, right? I don't. You can tell sometimes in the first year. Hey, I think this is going to work. Hey, I think this is not going to work. I do think no matter what, you probably deserve a second year to at least look forward, right? People weren't really freaking out when Kirby and company lost 5 games in year 1, but in year 2, you knew immediately what the future was at Georgia when Smart, convinced a bunch of players to stay, and they go on, and talent and depth and experience, which is something that's going to lack in college football from here on out. They had that in 2017 too, a team that was 3 points away from winning the national championship. And you saw in year 2, if Kirby Smart was going toe-to-toe with Nick Saban and Alabama like that, honestly, you should have won the national championship, right? You want to play that game in year 2. You knew things were going to be great for Georgia, and there were a couple bumps in the road between 17 and 21, but what Georgia has done is very special. My question is, will it ever get better than it has been? Have we seen the true glory days of Georgia football? It's a real question. What do you think? Links are down below. Thanks for watching this video.